It's almost like a new religion in that it has catechisms of states that you must believe, whether it be from the river to the sea, or trans women are women, or non-binaries
Yeah.
are valid, or we're all racist. There's a whole sort
Yeah.
of bundle of beliefs that go together, and that gives them a sense of a secular church. The pioneers of my art form were all women, and I refuse to kind of just stay silent. I think a lot of women are just being bullied and harassed. They're leaving the professions, whether it be trans, gender critical debate, racism, anti-Semitism, but it could almost be anything, because it's a way to shut down original thinking. It's highly authoritarian, and it's about sort of like stifling down any dissent.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Rosie Kay. Rosie, welcome to the show.
Hello. It's lovely to be back. Thank you.
So good to have you back on. While I was logging on, I thought to myself, this is an issue that you used to hear a lot of discussion about in the old days. I'm old enough to remember when you would switch on Channel 4 and there'd be a discussion about this topic, or you'd suddenly read about it in the press. And it's the question of artistic freedom. Freedom in the arts, how far artistic freedom should go, whether we have it or not, why it's important. I remember discussions like that all the time. You see it less frequently these days, except when it comes to you guys. You have launched an initiative called Freedom in the Arts, which is all about defending the right of artists to freedom of expression, self-expression, and the freedom to create work that they want to create. Fascinating initiative, and I guess we should just kick off by asking you what made you set this up and what your aim is with this group.
So some of your viewers and listeners will know that I went through my own very painful cancellation almost exactly 4 years ago, and I spoke out and went public about what I thought was both harms to women and children around trans ideology, but also wider the threat to freedom in the arts and to freedom, artistic expression. Um, I'd hoped that I'd just get back to making dance, not realizing actually that the culture around us was getting worse, not better, actually. And so I was kind of getting contacted very frequently by artists asking for help and support, and I was finding it a little bit overwhelming. Well, around the same time, Denise Farmy was a senior relationship officer at the Arts Council of 15 years standing, so a very established Arts Council administrator. She was trying to defend me and also the LGB Alliance. And through that, which I won't go into all the details, but you can find out, Denise was harassed and bullied by other staff from the Arts Council. In the end, she had to resign, and she took the Arts Council to an employment tribunal, and she won. Sorry, this is a long explanation. I will get there. But we met at the House of Lords, and we sat afterwards. We'd had a very good cross-peer sort of session about what was happening in the arts. And we looked at each other and we said, right, we're going to have to do something about this, aren't we? And so it's actually easier to support individual artists if you are umbrella organization rather than just me as Rosie Kay, a choreographer. So that's really what Freedom in the Arts started out as doing. In the first year, we supported over 100 artists. Sometimes that's just really holding people's hands and saying you're not going mad. And then also it's about getting them legal advice, writing letters for them, getting wider support, sometimes taking their cases to the press. And then over the last 2 years, what we've started and what we're still doing is evidence gathering. So we really are fighting back against that this is just some sort of cancel culture kind of nonsense, or that horrible thing where it doesn't exist. Well, it does exist, and it's destroying people's lives and livelihoods, and it's destroying the arts. So we have published a report, and we're doing a big deep dive on boycotts at the moment. And we take this to policymakers and parliamentarians, and we try and shape what's going on in the arts, or just draw attention to what's going on in the arts.
Yeah, that's a very useful overview. And I want to talk to you about your report and its findings, Afraid to Speak Freely, which is a fascinating read. I recommend it to all listeners. There it is. You mentioned just there your own experience of cancellation, which I often think of as one of the most brutal cancellations, up there with some of the worst ones like Kate Clanchy and others who I want to ask you about as well. We've talked about your cancellation before on this podcast. I'm sure many people will have listened to that. And as you've just said, it's the fourth anniversary of your cancellation. I saw you mention that on Instagram. Could you just give us a brief reminder of what happened? Because it is such a good example of some of the problems I want to talk to you about in relation to freedom in the arts. I know you've talked about this a million times, including with us, but if you could just give us a brief reminder of what happened there.
Well, I was in the midst of making a large-scale, huge production of Romeo and Juliet, and it was quite complicated. It was during COVID. It was through COVID rules. My father had just died of cancer. It was quite a stressful environment. And in order to kind of like bond with the young dancers, because they were all quite young, although some of them I'd known since they were teenagers, I'd maybe been their teacher previously. But they were all adults, they're professionals. I invited them to my home. It was in August, it was warm, and we sat outside and I had a dinner party. And late into the night, after midnight, they asked what my next show was. And I was 2 years into preparing a dance version of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. And it came down to a conversation around casting, whether this would be portrayed by a man or a woman, or should it be a trans or a non-binary performer. And then I was explicitly asked what my views were around sex and gender, and I defended the rights of women. And that got quite heated. I was defended quite robustly, but then also I kind of knew that people were upset, so I tried to sort of feather put sort of what's the word? Like sort of smooth the feathers of people that were upset. But going back to work, I faced a very hostile environment. I asked my board to get involved, and my board put me through one investigation, of which I was exonerated, but then there was an appeal. And even though that dancer had left the company, they put me through a really grueling second investigation, at which point I was so worried for my health. And I also had lost all respect for anyone that I worked with because they simply didn't understand the arguments. I decided to resign and start again from scratch.
I think even though what you went through was almost unbelievable, I think it's a good thing that you did start again because you've done some brilliant things since then, both in relation to choreography, which is your art, and also in relation to freedom in the arts. Um, yeah, it's a risky business standing up for the reality of womanhood and the rights of women these days, as many women can attest. That's one of the themes that you found, isn't it, in your report on Afraid to Speak Freely, which is based on a survey. Well, tell us a little bit about how you went about gathering the data for this report. I mean, it's a chilling read in parts, although there are flashes of optimism because people are clearly really angry about the current situation in the arts. But tell us about how you went about compiling the report.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember really quite recently that there was a conference hosted by Index on Censorship around freedom of expression in the arts. This is only like maybe 12, 13 years ago. So we had a look at all the literature that was out there quite recently, and Arts Professional had done a really interesting survey in 2019 exactly on freedom in the arts, freedom of expression. And so we asked permission if we could replicate this 2019 survey because we thought that the temperature had completely changed from 2019 to 2025, 24, 25. But we really wanted to show that evidence. So we actually replicated their survey, I mean, almost exactly, so that we kind of had comparable data. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the data coming in, I think sort of the first survey said around 30% of artists spoke rarely, openly, and honestly. By 2025, that had risen to 84% of artists rarely, never, or only sometimes spoke freely. So it's kind of extraordinary rise in self-censorship. And you're right, there's three main issues. The first is anything to do with gender critical, sex, gender, trans identity. As one respondent put it, they said, that's just career suicide. I wish I'd known, you know. The second was any pushback on racism or anti-racist policies, particularly policies that centered around critical race theory. And that sort of goes along with the sort of Kate Clanchy sort of furore around 2020 with George Floyd. But actually, that's turned now into anti-colonialization and decolonializing the curriculum and all this kind of stuff. Or white supremacy is coming up now. And then the third aspect, which has just gone huge over the past year, is anything to do with the conflict in the Middle East. So anything to do with Israel, Gaza, Palestine, um, is also incredibly dangerous for artists to speak about or have any association with Israel or even Judaism or even simply being Jewish.
I found that part of the report, I mean, not surprising, but shocking. So, but let's talk a bit about the women's rights issue first and the gender question. Because I think it's around half of respondents to the survey said that they felt it was dangerous to talk about this issue in the arts environments in which they work, which is extraordinary. Again, it's not particularly shocking given the influence of the trans ideology over the past few years, but it's still a shocking situation that people feel they can't express themselves on such fundamental questions of sex, gender, the existence of women, and so on. How do you think that's happened? I mean, you have some personal experience of it yourself, of course. How has that managed to take hold? What are the mechanisms through which something like that, a relatively new ideology, if you went back 15 or 20 years, you would not have encountered many people who thought that a man could become a woman simply by declaring himself to be one. And yet that now is a kind of article of faith among certain influential sections of society. How does that happen, and how does it manifest itself in the arts world? Is it simply a situation that artists keep their mouths shut because they know the consequences are too severe?
It is a really strange one, isn't it? And I think I saw the threat coming from around 2016, 2015 onwards, because I was looking at conspiracy theory for a show, and I saw it coming, and I literally was like, well, no one's daft enough to actually believe this. I think there was a lot of like misguided good intentions at the beginning. It was seen as the next human rights issue around like gay rights and I think Stonewall has a lot to blame, and but it's not just Stonewall because there's a whole myriad of organisations, not just in this country but across the world, that were pushing this. The more I looked into it, the more I saw that it was an incredibly well-funded, well-organised, and quite secretive movement that was really well placing itself inside organisations. I think then you had a sort of two-way problem going on. You had the young artists who were being trained not as artists, but as activists, who kind of started to bring this kind of sense of like, do you have the right values? Am I being oppressed? And bringing that into every single everyday situation, of which in the arts, actually, I think the middle generation were trying to be a bit cool and sort of like, "Hey guys, let's work collaboratively," and not being really honest about that there is a hierarchy in all organizations, and particularly in the arts. There is a hierarchy, there is an order, and there is like somebody who calls the shots at the end, the director. There was too much liberalism and trying to sort of stay down with the kids, and so that was sort of like adding to this. And then I'd say the top-down part is to do with leadership and governance, was very poorly educated. The Arts Council brought in quite a lot of, and all arts councils, in fact, some of the arts councils in, say, the nations like Wales and Scotland are even more incentivizing this kind of ideology than even the Arts Council. They were bringing in policies that were all about DEI, and this was then confusing people, and bad operators were coming into that space and being paid a lot of money to deliver completely false training. And I'm sorry to say, boards were made up of people who probably enjoyed the glass of warm white wine and the velvet carpets in the theatre. They weren't necessarily in it to absolutely have to fight tooth and nail to protect the arts. There's been a big generational shift. No one's really had to fight for this for quite a long time, and it's really showed up a lack of education and, quite frankly, intelligence. And that's a sad state of affairs for something like the arts, which really needs good independent thinkers.
Am I right in thinking that this impacts on women in the arts in particular? I mean, I know men speak out on this issue, of course. I like to count myself in that number. But I'm guessing that when you had such a high response to that question in particular, or lots of the feedback in your survey was in relation to the trans question, I'm guessing a lot of that came from women who felt they couldn't speak honestly about themselves and their lives in the arts environment.
It really does show the kind of rank misogyny that is underlying so many of what we thought. we I'm nearly 50, and I really thought I would thank my mother and my grandmother for the battles and the fight that they made for me to have an independent and financially independent life in the arts, and I've been absolutely shocked and devastated. I mean, I come from dance, so I know about bodies, and I also know about there being not very many men. So men often get the scholarships, they get more attention. Women are, if I have to find it, much more competitive. Then, as a dancer, if you have a baby, that's absolutely disastrous for your career. This is my argument. Going back to the dinner party of my dancers, it's like I nearly died in childbirth. Like, that's a very unique female experience. And I fought tooth and nail to get back into the dance world. This the pioneers of my art form were all women, and I refused to kind of just stay silent because that's wrong. And I think a lot of women are just being bullied and harassed. They're leaving the professions, and they're also being bullied and harassed off boards. And that's really shocking to me as well. There's lots of good women I've met who just said, I tried and I got ostracized and I got shoved out of this board position, or they got investigated for very sort of strange, tenuous things. So there's a kind of cull going on for all the bright, intelligent, ambitious women.
It's absolutely terrifying. And I did want to ask you about a couple of examples in relation to this issue in particular. Obviously, there's your own story, which you've touched on and people will be familiar with. I wanted to ask you about Rasheen Murphy. I have a vested interest in this part of the story because I'm a huge fan of hers. I've been listening to her for years and years. Um, she had an extraordinary experience. It goes back a couple of years now. She posted something on Facebook along the lines of, with quite fruity language, F puberty blockers and stop calling women turfs and don't drug kids, things that I would consider to be perfectly sensible and reasonable opinions. She had the most savage response, including from sections of her fan base and from the media. The most extraordinary event I thought was when The Guardian gave her album Hit Parade a 5-star review. And yet, even then, it felt compelled to say this album comes with the stain of her opinions, as if a woman should never express herself, keep quiet and sing, basically. That's what they were saying. What did you make of that story? Because that story also has an element of hope to it, I think, as well, because she's stayed successful. She still carried on performing. Her album did incredibly well. What did you make of that story and what it tells us, I guess, about the temperature of arts right now?
So there's a couple of interesting details about that the Facebook posts were actually private and they were leaked, so there's that. And then, she was kind of forced to make an apology, but she only apologized for the offense and hurt that she'd caused, and I found a lot of parallels with that. I also, because it's quite shocking when suddenly everybody's, like, sort of screamingly upset with you. That as an artist, we're not really equipped to say, "Yeah, whatever." We're quite sensitive, and that's our job to respond to people. We're in the sort of public spheres. So I think it was interesting that she didn't apologize about puberty blockers, she just apologized for the upset. I mean, I'm lucky enough to know her a little bit now. I think the intervening 2 years actually has been quite tough and quite painful. And I'd say the same for many artists I've met that have either been forced to keep silent or had to sign an NDA. I think it somewhat, as an artist, it eats you up inside when you're being forced to somehow silence yourself, to kind of stay being a good girl. And that isn't in her nature. Her nature is to be brave, to be curious, to be unpredictable. And so she's having to balance what she needs in order to continue to be an artist with the aftershocks of what that will do to her, and how that's playing out and rippling out inside the music industry. And the music industry, I'm quite shocked at what's going on actually, and they're almost trying to destroy the music industry from inside. It's musicians that are destroying other musicians. It's incredible. And I think people are going to have to kind of really realize that they're responsible for their own sectors. And if you go out and you start metaphorically lynching artists all the time for various different things, or even not saying things, you're destroying the whole sector. You're destroying the environment completely.
I mean, it is just extraordinary that in the 2020s, there are still women in the arts who feel they have to, zip their lip in case they get into trouble for holding certain views. I mean, I thought as you were saying earlier, earlier struggles, one would have presumed would have pushed all of that to one side and created an era of equality and liberty, but clearly that's now been undone. In relation to Roisin Murphy, I wonder if you could touch on the chilling effect of cases like this, because one thing that really struck me about the report that you guys did, the survey from Freedom in the Arts, um, is that is how this censorious culture takes effect, how it happens. I mean, you don't have people coming in with, their boots on, standing on people's throats and physically preventing them from saying certain things. I mean, we're not talking about the kind of Stasi nightmare of physically enforced correct thing, but rather it's a kind of more slippery, sinister culture of self-censorship where you know what the consequences might be and therefore you choose under pressure not to express yourself. Is that your experience, that a lot of those people responding just actually censor themselves and you have this spiral of silence, I guess, and then you have cases like Roisin Murphy and others, yours too, which then have a chilling effect because it reminds people of the consequences of saying what they think is true?
That's right, and then you've got, Kate Clanchy in literature, or Martin Speake in jazz music as well, and these are all quite violent cases, actually, although you say it's not the boot on the throat. This is about people losing, like, not just a job, but their entire livelihood, their entire reputation, things that they've set themselves up from scratch for maybe 20, 30 years, suddenly being expelled from. And I was, trying to remember that these people that are doing the attacking, they really do think they're right. They really do think that they're virtuous and they are doing something really powerful and wonderful. It's such an odd juxtaposition. It's really odd to see. Yeah, I think those artists that talked about the self-censorship really struck me as well. There was a poet who was quite an experimental poet, and in the poetry world had been quite successful. And he'd written a poem maybe about 10, 15 years ago from the perspective of a complicated female character. And he, in the interview, sort of case study that I did with him, talked about how now, if he starts to think of characters or situations that could be perceived as potentially dangerous, he actually stops the thought from going any further in his mind. And I think that's so extraordinary. And I guess one of the issues we've got is that you've got an art sector that's very heavily administrated and bureaucratic, whether that be curators or programmers or theatre venue directors. The artist is sort of right down at the bottom trying to come up with this sort of amazing new ideas, and you've got a heavy administrative class. And then you've got the actual audience, like the normal people. And I think audiences are starting to sense that our arts are feeling a little stale or stifled or maybe a bit hectoring and lecturing, but they don't quite know what's causing it, what that gap is. And there's this heavy, huge middle that's policing everything and squashing thought and new ideas.
I think it was Douglas Murray who recently said that theatres, which is what he was writing about, have become like think tanks. They they imagine that their role is to tell people ideas and how to think and how to approach the world, which is not what a theatre should do. In relation to the trans question, I did want to ask you about Graham Linehan as well. He's now obviously world famous as someone who put his neck on the line in a very real way on the trans question, and I think has pushed the dial in a positive direction. But I think sometimes there's a tendency to forget that his is also a case of artistic freedom. His is also a case of what's happening in the world of arts, because he lost, everyone will be familiar with his enormous contribution to the world of comedy and television. I mean, really up there with the greats of the past 20 years or so. And yet he was still brought really down low and essentially cancelled from the world of comedy as a consequence of his views on the truth of womanhood, the rights of gay people, and so on. Where do you think that story now stands? Because it does seem to have been one of those issues that has kind of opened a lot of people's eyes. When you have a comedian being arrested by armed officers at Heathrow Airport for writing a few piss-takey tweets, I mean, that is I heard two old men in a bar on the southern coast of Spain talking about that case, just at the bar drinking, saying, "Did you hear about the guy arrested at Heathrow?" I mean, that's the kind of situation where it really does blow it open for the public, doesn't it? And it makes them see that something has gone wrong here.
Yes, hopefully, but going back to that, these people believe that they're right. I think that Graham has been smeared so badly and so thoroughly that for anyone on let's say, for want of a better phrase, on the other side, can easily dismiss that from their mind as that Graham is some kind of extremist, or he's been incredibly rude, or
Right.
it's the
Yeah.
Bananarama thing. It's not what he said; it's the way that he said it.
Yeah.
And so while I think again it's having an effect hopefully on the public, I'm not sure that it's having an effect on the sector itself, sadly to say. And you're right, he's an absolute genius, and I feel very sad that we never got to see Father Ted the musical myself. I want to see that show.
Absolutely. That what a loss. In relation to that self-conviction that the other side has, for want of a better phrase, I mean, that really is striking. That's something I've encountered myself when I speak on university campuses or engage in media debates. You come up against people who are so self-righteous. It's extraordinary. And often their self-righteousness is completely out of proportion to the sensibleness of what they're saying. You know, there's a kind of real disparity between those two things. Where do you think that comes from? That kind of conviction that they have, even when it's on the basis of things that are provably untrue.
Well, it's quite a kind of complicated sort of hot mess, isn't it, of
Mm,
colliding forces. I think COVID sort of squashed quite a lot of people into strange online places, along with I mean, I'm just starting to read Joe Bartosh's fantastic book around pornography, and so there's this kind of strange sort of nasty darkness going on underneath people's private online world. I think horribly there's maybe a sense of pleasure in kind of this abuse and harassment and attacking, like they keep gaining scalps, This is quite a victory when you take the scalp of somebody like Graham Linehan, someone who's clearly, truly, incredibly talented, or Roisin Murphy, absolutely super talented person. They can claim a talented scalp. I think there's envy. I think they hope that they can somehow insert themselves into the space that's left. And then I think there's something really deep and spiritual going on where it's almost a vacuum. There's a vacuum of meaning in people's lives, and this gives them absolute clear meaning and purpose. And now it's a perverted sense of meaning because actually the arts have a meaning unto themselves, and there's a true discipline and there's a true beauty to the arts and what they do. But when you insert yourself into it and your identity as being the first and foremost thing, that actually is not art. That's actually sort of psychotic narcissism. And there seems to be an outbreak of that. I mean, it's almost like we've talked, I'm sure we've mentioned this before, it's almost like a new religion in that it has catechisms of states that you must believe, whether it be from the river to the sea, or trans women are women, or non-binaries
yeah.
are valid, or we're all racist. There's a whole sort of bundle of beliefs that go together, and that gives them a sense of a secular church in some regards.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. That rings very true. You just mentioned that we're all racist as one of the chants we're supposed to most supposed to make, and I did want to ask you about that part of your survey because I think it's around 13% of respondents said that they found it very difficult, in some cases dangerous, to raise issues to do with anti-racism or diversity. I often find myself saying so-called anti-racism because I consider myself an anti-racist. I'm sure you do as well, and racism is a bad thing. That I think that goes without saying. But what we're talking about is something quite different, isn't it? The kind of, as you mentioned already, the institutions of DEI and the ability of artists to criticize those or push back against them or to lament the impact they might have on artistic freedom and artistic choices. So could you say a little bit about what role DEI is playing in the arts world now and why you think people find it difficult to raise questions about that?
During COVID, I think every funded arts council organisation sort of had to go through some sort of like struggle session around how racist they all were. Um, and 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 things came in like actual quotas, whether it be on board representation or company makeup. And I think again, going back to what I said earlier, there's like a little element of truth or good intentions that sort of started it, but very quickly it sort of then descended into something that was about was actually, sorry to say, I think I found it quite racist because it was about skin color rather than anything like actually helping to remove barriers into the arts, of which they're huge because it's so hard to make a livelihood in the arts, and, often I meet, families, especially in dance, families who whose parents say, "I really don't want my son or daughter to go into the arts because it's such an unstable workplace. I'd much rather they got a stable job that paid a good wage." So those are the barriers, but just putting a quota on the end product, I thought was very short-sighted and also slightly insulting. If you were someone that was brought on, could you really be sure that you were brought on for your skills and talent, or was it the color of your skin? So there's one case in particular I mentioned earlier, Martin Speak, who their anti-racism policy in the organization stated that all music was institutionally and systemically racist, including jazz music. And he's a jazz musician of long standing and great reputation. And he said that he didn't feel that in a confidential email to the vice chancellor, said that he didn't think jazz was institutionally racist. In fact, the great heroes of jazz were black, and for that, he lost his job, his livelihood, and everything. Um, I've had quite a few people saying that they believe in Martin Luther King's, colorblind approach, and that has all been classed as racist, which I think's, again, one of these, like, you can say it's sort of a generational difference, but it's a kind of philosophical difference as well, and that doesn't mean that people don't recognize that there are some sort of issues around wealth and poverty, but I'd say, again, it goes back to wealth, poverty, and class is just as important as well in the arts.
Yeah, I remember reading some speech codes from American campuses a few years ago, and you realize quite quickly that Martin Luther King would not be welcome on those campuses these days, because it was stuff like, if you say that I don't see race or I just think there's one human race, that was judged to be a racist microaggression in the current climate. And the way in which what was considered to be the great liberal ideal 50 years ago is now reimagined as a kind of racist speech is extraordinary. I did want to ask you about Kate Clanchy, who you mentioned, and listeners will be familiar with her case because it was one of the most savage cancellations. So she wrote a book, an Orwell Prize winning book about her time teaching in state schools and the kids she met. It was an incredibly well received book. And then suddenly in 2020, I think, or certainly during that kind of period of COVID/George Floyd madness when the whole world seemed to go completely insane. People dug out phrases from the book, certain lines, took them out of context, and she was accused essentially of being almost like a Nazi-style racist. It was just staggering, and she lost almost everything as a consequence of that. What do you think that case told us about the racism discussion in particular, and how it became so frazzled and so fried and so difficult to have honest discussions about people's views or their right to self-expression?
What was interesting about Kate's case was, that her hounders, as Jenny Lindsay puts it, her hounders were all public. It was all played out publicly with their own names on Twitter, and these were people that worked in publishing, worked in literature, worked in poetry, and they were clearly enjoying themselves was what I
Yeah,
thought when I
yeah.
looked at it. They called her something like KK Clancy, like with 3 Ks. And I think, like, the racism one is just one of the most difficult ones actually when I deal with, like, case, work when people come to me. I always feel that's the one that I'm most worried for the person accused of it, because when you come to gender critical and you hear a woman and she says, like, "I know that women are real," we all know, yes, women are real. When it comes to an accusation of racism, the minute you say, "I'm not racist," I you sound like you're racist, you suddenly have to justify, you know you have to justify yourself in really odd ways. It's very hard to prove that you're not the thing that they're calling you, and it seems to kind of, like, really hurt people's brains and identities. It really causes a sort of fracture inside of themselves, and Kate speaks really eloquently about how this destroyed her inside. It really did. She was really, it risked her life. There's no question about this. Um, what their motivation was, I mean, really, this is one where it looks to me like jealousy. It really does. Sport and jealousy.
I think your description of the blood sport nature of it feels so accurate, and you see that in cancellations across the board. I mean, Kate Clanchy's was an extreme version of it, but you do often see it, and you think to yourself, you watch these people and you think, you're enjoying this, aren't you? You're getting a moral kick out of being part of a mob that is might potentially destroy someone's life. there's an element of cruelty to it. Is there ever a reckoning on the other side? We should probably stop using that phrase, but there you go. Is there ever a reckoning on that side with themselves, with what they've done? I mean, interestingly, there seems to have been one around Kate Clanchy, and she now has got an apology from her publishers who treated her so appallingly and went along with the mob. Um, do you think her case in particular, there was a Radio 4 a series about it as well, a show about it. Does that case suggest that there might be a reckoning coming amongst those people who were so destructive and so censorious, or do you not think so?
Well, funnily enough, the apology only came from the publisher because it's a new chief exec.
Right. Yeah.
So I think we're going to have. I don't think we'll get apologies. I don't. I think these people are going to have to hold on to the fact that they felt virtuous and right at the time, probably forever. Because if they really do face it, I think it would. I just don't think they can. I don't think they can. I've certainly not come across it in my case. Actually, I mean, I've heard. I was very ill last year, and I heard that one of my sort of hounders had sort of expressed concern, and it made me feel so ill inside because, of course, they never actually got in touch or gave a message. It seems so cheap and so lame. I don't think we'll get apologies. I think on the one hand, my fingers are crossed that institutions are waking up, like leadership is having to sort of kick in a bit because they've got so many problems. They can't pretend it's not going to happen to them because it will happen to them. And if they haven't got their house in order, it will be a bloody mess. So I think that leadership, it's changing, new leaders coming in, and it's a chance for a clean slate, and they can give apologies and they can move on and they can sort out their HR and their employees and their activist groups, and they can get back to their proper mission and purpose, which is art itself. And I think also what gives me hope is that we're all setting up our own things and getting on with it and working with really fantastic people who know their priorities. So there's a case of like normal change is going to happen and this stuff will eventually fade away. There'll be a kind of memory hold, put everything, and then there'll be a lot of new, vigorous, energized, ambitious new organizations that are going to take over the space that's vacated.
Yeah, I think that's a hopefully that things will shift in that direction. Um, I want to ask you about one more theme in relation to your survey, which is the Israel-Palestine question, the Middle East question. I think around a quarter of respondents to your survey raised it as a problem, as something they felt they couldn't speak out on. And it seems primarily, this won't surprise listeners, but it seems primarily that those who are of a pro-Israel persuasion, and even maybe just people who are Jewish and have pride in that kind of tradition and culture and the Jewish homeland, it's those who feel less able to speak their truth and to say what they think. What were those findings, and how surprised were you by those?
Well, I wasn't surprised because I'd been hearing it for really since October 7th. And I even had a bit of a premonition about it before October 7th. I'd started to look at Jewish artists and what was going on there. For some reason, I guess when you start to see people attacking, witches and all the rest of it, anti-Semitism was in the back of my mind. So since October 7th, things have got very difficult for anyone who defends Jewish artists or being Jewish or Israel defends Israel. Um, and I'd say it's actually got even worse than from when the report was published. This summer has been absolutely terrible in terms of, with Glastonbury, with Kneecap, with Bob Vylan, with Bailey Gifford, with sponsors, Barclays, BP, the Edinburgh International Book Festival, the list. It was a terrible summer. The boycotts and the sort of fossil-free books and all these kind of activists who, again, are very well funded and very well organized. Even if they look like they're grassroots, they're not. There's an entire infrastructure behind them. They're having a really massive impact on just about all the arts. And we're also seeing that activism spilling onto the stages, onto the paintings in the art galleries, into the orchestras, into the on stage even. We're having protests on stages. It's just, genuinely dangerous and terrifying for artists and for audiences. So yes, we are actually conducting now a second survey just about boycotts and anti-Semitism, we feel it really is important to really understand and again show the evidence to what is going on. So looking at systemically, like the quiet blacklisting, the deplatforming, the silent cancellations, but also very specifically the evidence about the actual cases where people are getting attacked or harassed. I have to say, on one point though, we have defended an artist who got a warning for having pro-Palestine views, and that was quite a rare organisation. I just want to say that Freedom in the Arts really is impartial, and we really do we take everything on a case by case basis, and we'll defend artists if we feel that they're being bullied, harassed, or silenced, and as long as their views are legal, we will try to support them. So, but that is like one or two cases out of maybe hundreds of the other opinions.
Yeah, I mean, it's so obvious, even though I don't know this issue in as nearly as much depth as you do, it's so obvious even to me as a layperson, outside observer, that it's far more the people who are pro-Israel or even just, in favor of Jewish people having access to the arts and expressing themselves. It's that side that is getting the flack massively. And there's so much hypocrisy as well, because you will have, whenever there's a whisper that Kneecap's visa to America might be cancelled, the whole left goes absolutely bananas, saying that's outrageous. But then when Johnny Greenwood is cancelled for performing with Dudu Tassa from Israel, it's often the same people calling for their cancellation as they are opposing the supposed cancellation of Kneecap. It's just an extraordinary double standard. And in relation to the boycott question, it's really interesting. I'm so happy to hear that you guys are looking into that. That's an incredibly important issue. What can you tell us so far? Because obviously there's been BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, for a long time, which is presented as a kind of progressive policy, but it often ends up just silencing Israeli artists and dancers and musicians. And that seems to have gone on steroids over the past 2 years since 7th of October. What can you tell us about what you're seeing so far in relation to the boycott question?
It's destroying like bands. It's making festivals very hostile places. So, you could buy a ticket for Kneecap and you might know what you're getting. But when you go to a festival and you want to see a whole array of artists, um, you don't want to end up in an environment where you've got people that are literally inciting hatred against the national army of defense of a legitimate sovereign country. So, the death to the IDF, which is, really shocking, and also live broadcast on TV. But there's also, just the really small cases that it's very hard to find a publisher that will publish a book, never mind if it's anything to do with Israel, Judaism, but even if it's just a Jewish writer, it's very hard for them to find a publisher. Israeli dance companies cannot come to the UK at present. I mean, all of it's just so shocking and so sort of obvious to me, that I'm sort of a bit baffled as to why it's not obvious to other people, and how have we forgotten our history so quickly? Um, and again, these are, like I said, this is a well-funded, well-organized sort of movement, but also these people are fervent, maniacal about the belief that they are correct and everybody else is wrong. There is just such black and white thinking, and we're talking about a really complex geopolitical war situation. I don't think anyone in the arts is particularly qualified to, to use their platform to tell everybody else what they should think. It's just, it's so arrogant to me as well.
I really agree. If you find yourself boycotting Jewish film festivals, Jewish dance troupes, and Jewish musicians who play at the proms or wherever else it might be, then it's possible you might not actually be one of the good guys. And I think that this is the issue on which I think it's most clear that the kind of new culture of censorship and hysteria in the arts is actually incredibly poisonous and in some cases racist. I mean, this is the irony of the kind of anti-racism question that we were just talking about. If you want to see actual racism, you just look at the way in which Jewish artists are being treated these days, which is pretty scandalous. I did want to just close by asking you a little bit about the nature of artistic freedom and what it means to you, because it used to be, well, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I thought it was a pretty settled question for a period of time anyway. There were huge battles over the counterculture in the 1960s and the 70s, and the rights of artists against, I don't know, people like Mary Whitehouse, or kind of more fundamentalist wing of conservative culture that was always keen to clamp down on art and, censor certain plays and so on. That went on for years and years and years and decades, in fact, centuries, and artists pushed back against it. We now seem to be back to square one, except this time it's the so-called liberals and progressives who are enforcing the dogma rather than, the Inquisition, or, the religious hotheads, or whoever else it might have been in the past. How's that switcheroo happen, do you think? And what would you say to those people in terms of why artistic freedom is actually really important?
I know it's incredible. I was speaking to a theatre director, and she was saying, "We're just so terrified, we don't know which might be the production that suddenly causes the furore and the scandal. It could happen at any moment." And I said to her, "Well, what we could do with is a new version of the Lord Chamberlain, so that you kind of put it into the government and get it pre-approved, and then you're safe." And she actually nodded in
Wow.
agreement until I said that was a joke. Like, that was a joke.
Wow.
So I think something like this is a little bit my pet theory. Something we thought was really positive in the 90s was the kind of big amount of funding that went into the arts. So we started getting the National Lottery funding, so that suddenly went from like a few millions to like almost £1 billion of funding in the arts. And we have a kind of interesting um, mixed economy where you have the kind of subsidized, publicly subsidized taxpayers' money, National Lottery funded arts that can be experimental, they can be out there, they can be original. It's like brilliant new thinking, risk taking. And that feeds into incredibly world class, world famous commercial sector. And there's quite a good interplay between the two. But when the Arts Council sort of like increased its funding, and you'll remember the Blair years where it was kind of like lots of regeneration kind of funding, lots of big new buildings, there was a kind of corporatization of the arts. Um, and that for a while we all just inhabited those glass buildings going, wow, this is funky and cool. And we got a nice glass view over, I don't know, the River Tyne or something. Um, but actually through that, the grew a corporate sort of mentality as well. And so really oddly, I think on the one hand, there's this kind of corporatization, risk-averse culture at its core. And then at the other, I think, like, almost perversely, there's a kind of Marxist idealism of whatever they believe equity is. And so we've talked in detail about these issues, whether it be the transgender critical debate, racism, anti-Semitism, but it could almost be anything because it's a way to shut down original thinking. It's highly authoritarian, and it's about sort of like stifling down any dissent as well. So there's a kind of mix. There's a a corporate public enterprise going on to kind of create this very stifling environment.
Yeah, corporate slash communist imposition on the arts. I think that's very well described. Okay, my last question for you, Rosie, is you've touched on this already, and you've talked about the 1,000 flowers that are blooming in relation to, the rediscovery of freedom, the rediscovery of artistic freedom. And I mean, there are so many groups now. There's you guys in relation to the arts. There's the Free Speech Union. There are so many gender critical organizations which defend not only the reality of womanhood, but the right to speak freely in the public realm. So there's loads of good stuff happening. And I guess my question is, how optimistic do you feel? And in relation to the arts in particular, have you found that there's an appetite, even though your survey describes very well a culture of fear? Is there also a corresponding appetite, I guess, for greater freedom and for something to change in that world?
In my bones, I feel there is. Like, I think we're absolutely going in the right direction, and it's taking brave people turning themselves into organizations and building followers and building, reputation and building a voice, like really finding a voice. I'm a dancer, for God's sake. Oh, I'm not now I do loads of speaking as well. It's incredible. However, at the moment, there's a real block because we really don't have our own venues yet. And that's partly to do with just like the sort of fundraising, the money that we're literally firefighting all the time. And we don't we don't have the kind of like the new buildings, the new institutions, the new places. I mean, you'll have seen it with Spite that they got cancelled from Rich Mix 2 weeks ago. This is a publicly funded organisation. They cannot discriminate. However, there's no protections in place under their funding agreements to protect freedom of expression. So there's a bit of a fight, and there's a bit of kind of like, we need to find spaces where we can turn up and share our art.
Rosie, thank you very much.